My wife was incredulous when I showed up at dinner hidden from her with a strange man, so I walked to the table where they were, kept my eyes fixed on her, so safe, so comfortable next to him, and said, in a firm, icy voice and loud enough for everyone around to hear, "I'm glad you found a new partner, because I'm divorcing you right now." She was desperate. Her eyes widened, the fork she was holding fell onto the plate, the wine glass trembled in her hand and she tried to say something, anything, but her mouth only opened, dry, empty, stuttering, without the courage to deny what was obvious, without the strength to justify herself in front of the audience who, in that elegant restaurant, were now watching us as if it were a play. I remained there for a few seconds, feeling something between the most devastating pain of my life and a certain relief, because at that moment I finally saw clearly who she really was, what she had done to me and what I should do next. For weeks, maybe even months, I had felt something strange at home. Those subtle absences that she justified with flimsy excuses. The messages she quickly deleted. The perfume that was sometimes not the same as what I used to smell on her. I preferred to fool myself, pretend that everything was fine, that she was just tired, stressed, busy with life. But deep down, I already knew. I just didn't want to admit it. I clung to every gesture of affection like a hungry man clings to crumbs. But there was one night in particular, and this whole story starts there, a night when I decided to no longer be the idiot who believed in love while being betrayed. She had left saying she was going to dinner with a college friend, someone I had never met in person but who she talked about often. The name was already familiar enough not to arouse suspicion. But the difference that night was instinct. You know that moment when something inside you says, go. It just goes. Without planning, without thinking, just go. So I went. I got in the car, drove aimlessly, followed the GPS to a new restaurant that she had mentioned a few days ago, and there, standing on the other side of the street, I saw it. I saw her arriving, dressed up, radiant, with a smile that hadn't been mine for a long time. She was not alone. I was with him. It wasn't the kind of scene we expect to see one day, and yet, there it was, my wife laughing at something he said, touching his arm lightly, like someone who already feels too comfortable. The kind of intimacy that can't be built in one night. The kind of intimacy that destroys everything that has been built for years. I entered the restaurant, approached the table, and said what needed to be said. When she tried to get up, she tripped over her own guilt. And him? He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, without courage, without dignity, without enough shame. As if I had already expected this, as if I knew that sooner or later I would appear. The most curious thing. She tried to follow me to the parking lot. He tried to stop me from leaving. He said he could explain. That it wasn't what it seemed. That I was confused. Confused? After 32 months of me being faithful, loving, present, was she confused? When I hugged her in the pain of losing her father, when I held her hand on the nights she cried missing her mother, when I sold part of my business to have more time with her, there, in that wet parking lot, between her screams and my contained anger, I understood that there was no confusion at all. There were choices. She chose to betray me. He chose to destroy our history. And now, there, on her knees on the asphalt, she was reaping the first consequences. What she didn't know, and here begins the real twist of fate, is that I had already known everything for 3 weeks. That I had already hired a lawyer. That the divorce paperwork was already done, just waiting for official delivery. And more than that, to my luck or perhaps by pure divine justice, all the assets of our marriage had been legally protected by me. The house, the car, the investments, everything was in my name. I got ahead of myself. By intuition. Out of caution. For self-love. She didn't know, but by cheating, she lost not only trust, but also comfort. And freedom. The following weeks were a spectacle of silent humiliation. First came the messages. Then the calls. Then the pathetic attempts to appear in the places I frequented. Sometimes crying, sometimes pretending maturity. Don't you want to talk? Can't we start over, think about everything we've been through? But everything we experienced, everything that really mattered, she herself destroyed. I no longer needed to hear explanations. I had already heard everything in that one sentence she said at dinner. I didn't know you were coming. I did not know. That was all. She never thought she would get caught. Because betrayal feeds on the certainty of impunity. But life, this one, has its cruel and elegant way of delivering justice. The man she got involved with, and here comes a tasty detail, was an employee in the legal department of the company where I work. And when it all came to light, he was fired. Moral harassment, unethical conduct, breach of contract. And her? She, who was once invited to corporate dinners, began to be avoided. Cancelled. Ignored. Alone. Because people, no matter how hypocritical they are, still pretend to value fidelity, and it had become a symbol of the opposite. Meanwhile, I moved on. I was late, yes. I cried, a lot. I felt anger, contempt, shame. But I also had friends by my side. I reunited with family members who had been distant for a long time. I took care of myself. I went back to running in the park. I traveled alone. I relearned how to cook. And in one of those moments when we don't expect anything, I found someone. Someone who didn't need to fix me. Who just wanted to accompany me. Who smiled when I talked about the pain, and who didn't judge when I talked about the past. She heard me. In truth. And in that complicit silence, I understood that starting over is not betrayal of those who betrayed us. It's forgiving ourselves. The former woman in my life tried to come back, as do ghosts who still think they have some chance of redemption. He came to me at work. He appeared at the door of my house. He asked to come in, to talk. And all she said, in a desperate tone, was, "Just give me one chance, just one. I've changed." But there, standing there, looking into her eyes, I realized that I was the one who had changed. And the most ironic thing of all is that she thought she would still be entitled to half of what we had built. Little did he know that, by crossing that line of betrayal, she had also signed, without realizing it, the end of any rights. But the question remains, why does someone cheat even when they have everything? Why would someone destroy their own castle for an adventure? Why would someone risk their entire life for dinner? Maybe the answer lies in what she once said to me, without realizing the impact it would have, "I just wanted to feel wanted again." Was that it? Or was it just vanity, selfishness and the certainty that I would never find out? Because the problem with betrayal is not just in the act itself. It's premeditation. It's in the construction of the lie. In the blank stare during breakfast. In the automatic kiss before bed. In, "I love you," said out of habit, while loving someone else in secret. And even now, after everything, I still find myself thinking, what would have happened if I hadn't gone to that restaurant that night? If I had ignored instinct and stayed home, believing what she said? Would we be sleeping in the same bed, while she would continue cheating on me with others? Would I still be being deceived, while she smiled at clandestine dinners? Or would she, at some point, confess? But one thing is certain, at that dinner, I didn't lose a wife. I freed myself from a lie. And I gained the opportunity to rediscover the truth, first in myself, then in someone who knew how to see value where the other only saw routine. And now, with everything said, there's only one question left: does she really regret it, or does she just regret losing what she'll never have again? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize and never support any type of betrayal. All stories are fictitious, but based on realities that show how betrayal destroys lives, families and hearts. The objective is clear: open your eyes, provoke reflection and never normalize the unforgivable. Get ready. The story you will hear now is shocking, intense and impossible to forget. Good story. Daniel and Clara met on an ordinary day, but they became an extraordinary couple in the eyes of everyone around them. He is a meticulous architect, passionate about lines, shapes and the art of transforming ideas into homes. She, a literature teacher, delicate and intense, one of those who knew how to draw tears from a student when reciting a verse by Neruda. They had in common a passion for details, for late-night conversations and the feeling that, even in silence, they were able to say everything to each other. The connection between them was, in the early years, one that one admires from afar, with a hint of envy and another of inspiration. They formed a harmonious, synchronized, almost cinematic couple. They got married in a large garden surrounded by yellow ipe trees, surrounded by friends, with a clear sky blessing the day that, for both of them, seemed to be the beginning of an eternal story. The apartment where they decided to live together was hand-picked, in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by bookstores, discreet cafes and flower-filled balconies. Clara said that the plants on the balcony told her mood, and Daniel laughed, saying that they only bloomed because they wanted to please her. The walls of the house came to life with paintings that he chose with a technical eye and that she accepted with an open heart, completing the aesthetic with touches of color and delicacy in the objects. The atmosphere was calm, serene, balanced, just as their relationship appeared to be. In the first years of marriage, everything flowed naturally. Breakfasts were long on the weekends, with Daniel reading the newspaper while Clara lost herself in the open books on the table. Sometimes, she would interrupt him to read a passage aloud, and he would listen with a smile that mixed tenderness and pride. They had simple but unbreakable rituals: dinner on Fridays at the Italian restaurant on the corner, walks hand in hand on Sunday afternoons, exchanging notes hidden around the house on days when routine seemed to swallow them up. The complicity was evident. When someone asked how long they had been together, they looked at each other and responded in unison, long enough to know that we are still learning. But like everything in life, constancy gave way to predictability. The routine, initially comfortable, became repetitive. Daniel, increasingly absorbed by projects, began to arrive home later. He was recognized in the industry as a rare talent, and this brought new responsibilities, more travel, sleepless nights in front of the computer and the inevitable feeling of tiredness. Clara, in turn, immersed herself more and more in school classes, preparing creative classes, engaging students, trying to keep alive a passion that she felt was being replaced by obligations. Although they continued to respect each other and maintain visible affection, long conversations became short, lingering looks became distractions on the cell phone, and the touch of hands was replaced by the coldness of a hasty kiss on the forehead. The once vibrant house began to become silent. The plants on the balcony, once lush, began to dry out one by one, and Clara justified it by saying that the weather was strange, that the climate had changed. Daniel smiled without much conviction. They both knew something was different, but neither had the courage or willingness to face the truth. It was easier to pretend it was just a phase. Phases pass, they told themselves. It was the speech of someone who wants to maintain what they have built, even without knowing how to repair what is slowly wearing out. Despite the changes, they continued to be seen as the model couple. At family parties, they held hands to appear united. At lunches with friends, they exchanged programmed smiles and repeated stories of old trips, as if they were still the same couple as before. But Clara's eyes began to seem more distant, as if they were searching for something that she herself couldn't name. Daniel's, on the other hand, carried a tiredness that could not be explained just by poor night's sleep. The love was still there, perhaps dormant, perhaps curled up in a corner of the chest, but the feeling was that they were both walking in opposite directions, even though they shared the same roof. Their wedding anniversary that year was celebrated with a simple dinner at home. Daniel bought flowers at the flower shop on the corner, as he did every year, but forgot to remove the plastic that covered the bouquet. Clara, upon receiving it, smiled reflexively, thanked her and placed the flowers in the vase without saying anything else. There was no menu, no wine, no background soundtrack. Just silence and an attempt at normality. After dinner, he went back to the computer to finish a digital model, and she retired to her room, reading the same excerpt from a book that no longer made sense. The night ended with the lights off and the space between them in bed feeling bigger than ever. Clara started hanging out more with a childhood friend, Sophia, who lived a few blocks away. Together, they took short trips on the weekends, watched plays and rediscovered old cafes around the city. Daniel said he thought it was great that she was taking care of herself, although he barely paid attention when she talked about her outings. He seemed more interested in answering emails than in listening to the woman he shared his life with. And that hurt more than any fight. It hurt because there was no conflict, just indifference. One night, sitting on the sofa, Clara turned to him and asked if he still thought she was beautiful. Daniel took a long time to respond, as if the question were a mathematical problem. He said yes, of course, but without emotion, as if responding out of obligation. She forced a smile, but something inside her cracked. It was on that day that she began to rethink what she was experiencing. She wasn't thinking about separation, not at that moment, but she wanted, and she didn't dare admit it, to feel seen again. She wanted to hear words that would remind her of who she was before she was a wife, before she was a shadow of the vibrant woman she once was. He began to notice that the nights were getting too long. Sleeping was difficult, waking up even more so. I felt like I was failing as a man, as a husband, as a human being. But he didn't talk about it. He washed it all down with the bitterness of a midnight glass of whiskey. Pride prevented him from admitting that the relationship was falling apart. He had gotten so used to being the provider, the solid one, the unshakable one, that he didn't know how to show vulnerability. And, little by little, the two stopped looking for each other even in the dark. Despite this, they still shared coffees, still wished each other good morning, still laughed occasionally at a funny video, still knew each other's favorite dishes. But these small sparks, which previously lit fires, were now insufficient to warm the cold that had settled between them. Clara started to arrive home later, saying that the rehearsals for the school's theater project had intensified. Daniel didn't question it. He just shook his head and went back to work. Both began to live a kind of silent coexistence, where affection was ritual, but it was no longer a choice. And while life continued its course, like an apparently calm river about to reach the rocks of the cliff, a silent storm was forming in the distance. Invisible, but inevitable. A rupture was waiting for the right moment to happen. And in that time of silence, of averted looks, of forgotten promises, the story that seemed perfect began to crumble around the edges. But there were still no screams, no scandals. Just two bodies sharing space and two hearts that, one day, beat in unison, but now began to fall apart. The routine continued without apparent noise, but the silences between Daniel and Clara began to have the weight of steel. There were no longer the same silences as before, those filled with comfort and complicity, but rather disconcerting, avoided pauses. The gesture of serving coffee, previously spontaneous, began to be done with a certain automatism, almost by protocol. The goodnight kiss was light, quick, like a bureaucratic touch amid the formality of two strangers who still share a bed. Conversations now revolved around daily tasks, schedules and commitments. What used to flow naturally now required effort, almost as if each sentence needed justification. Still, neither of them put into words what they felt. Daniel convinced himself that it was just a prolonged phase, one of those moments when wear and tear speaks louder, while Clara tried to find, in the fog of her own thoughts, some reason for the feeling of absence that grew within her, like an invisible infiltration slowly destroying the structures that were once solid. It was during this period, between half-truths and averted glances, that Clara started attending a night theater course, claiming to be part of a school project with more advanced students. Daniel encouraged her, even though inside he felt a discomfort that was difficult to identify. He didn't question it. He just accepted it, as he had been doing with everything that seemed to slip through his fingers. She came out more tidy than usual, with clothes she hadn't worn in months, perfumes he no longer saw on her dressing table, makeup that didn't match the exhausting days she claimed to have. But he didn't dare ask. He was afraid of the answer, afraid of the definitive break, afraid of what his intuition was already beginning to scream in silence. When Clara returned, around 10 or 11 at night, she looked scattered, as if she were still somewhere else. She said she was tired, took a quick shower and lay down, turning to the opposite side, saying, "Good night," with her voice muffled into the pillow. The distance grew worse, but it was surrounded by subtleties. Clara, on certain days, came home lighter, more smiling, as if she had experienced something beautiful. I cooked more cheerfully, laughed spontaneously, and even tried to revive some old conversations. But they were moments that soon became empty. Daniel noticed, but pretended not to. He wanted to fool himself a little more. Even his closest friends started to notice the difference. At a casual dinner, one of them commented in a relaxed tone that Clara looked refreshed, even younger. Daniel just laughed, diverting the topic. But inside, doubt was beginning to take root. Something was different. Something escaped the logic of silent nights and the absence of affection. He knew, but he still didn't want to accept it. It was during a sleepless night that Daniel decided, without warning, to pick her up from the course. It was a Friday. He said he would stop by the office later, which was common. But instead of going to the drawing board and the projects, he took the car and parked discreetly a block away from the place where Clara said she was participating in theater classes. Waited. The clock said 10:30 at night when he saw Clara leave the building. She was not alone. She walked next to a tall, unshaven, well-dressed man, with an easy smile and a gaze focused on her. They seemed intimate. They talked naturally, and Clara touched his arm as he spoke, laughing at something he said. They stopped on the sidewalk, facing each other. The man held her hand, and for a second Daniel felt as if the air had been knocked from his lungs. Then, a kiss. Slow. Delicate. Family. The kind of kiss that happens when there is no rush, when there is contained desire, when there is feeling. Daniel didn't look away. He watched the scene like someone watching their own life being scratched with a blade. He returned home without knowing exactly how he managed to drive. He entered, took off his shoes, sat down on the sofa and remained there, motionless. When Clara arrived, half an hour later, she entered with the lightness of someone without guilt. She said she was exhausted, that rehearsals had gone on longer than usual, and that the students were difficult to manage. Daniel just nodded. She asked if he wanted tea, he said no. He went to sleep. He stayed there. The silence that morning was like a private funeral, where tears didn't fall, but the pain was screaming. There, without witnesses, Daniel learned that their marriage was over. But it wasn't time to say it out loud yet. He needed to understand more. He needed to be sure, even if the certainty had already shot through him like an arrow. In the following days, his attitude changed. He remained kind, but more observant. Clara noticed the distance and tried to start small conversations. Daniel was smiling back, but his eyes were cold, almost clinical. He started arriving home earlier, avoiding unnecessary trips, moving around spaces that didn't interest him before. I went through the drawers, observed the details, looked for signs. He didn't find much evidence, just the absence of it, which, for him, said even more. An almost empty bottle of perfume hidden in the bag, new underwear, torn notes at the bottom of the trash, messages deleted more frequently. Nothing explicit. But everything screamed betrayal. Still, he held back. He knew that a hasty accusation could give her the perfect excuse to victimize herself. He wanted to wait. Make her comfortable, safe, so she could make the fatal mistake. That's when he had the idea of making an invitation. A dinner, just the two of them, at the restaurant where they celebrated one of their first anniversary. Clara hesitated and said that she already had a commitment to the theater group, but that she might be able to cancel it. The next day, I said it would be difficult. Daniel pretended to understand. He said it was okay, they would schedule it for another day. But something inside him was already moving with surgical precision. He found out, from a coworker, that the restaurant where he planned to take her would be hosting a private dinner for a company client, and that the place would be emptier and more elegant that night. It was the perfect setting for what he planned. On the day of the rehearsal, Daniel left work early. He put on his best shirt, stopped by a flower shop, bought a bouquet identical to the one he had given Clara on their first date, and drove to the restaurant. He arrived in advance, spoke to the manager, and asked to be seated at a more private table, where he had a good view of the room. Ordered a drink. And waited. It didn't take long. Shortly after 8, she entered. Beautiful. Radiant. Impeccable makeup, slightly wavy hair, a dress he hadn't seen in a while. She was not alone. The same man from the night of the course entered with her, laughing, holding her waist naturally. Clara seemed safe, comfortable, like someone who was living a light, forbidden, exciting romance. They sat down. They ordered wine. They talked. They laughed. The minutes passed like an eternity. Daniel watched every gesture, every look, every touch. There was no denying it. She wasn't just involved with another man. She was in love. That wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. Then he got up. He crossed the room in silence. He approached the table with firm steps. When she saw him, she froze. The color drained from his face, his eyes widened. The other man looked confused, as if he didn't understand the plot of the play he entered. Daniel just looked at her and said with a calmness that bordered on contempt, "I'm glad you found a new partner, because I'm divorcing you right now." The cup shook in her hand. The fork fell onto the plate. And for a second, the entire restaurant stopped. Clara tried to get up, say something, stammer out a justification. But Daniel wouldn't listen. He turned his back and left. Outside, the air seemed lighter. In his chest, the pain still throbbed, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was in control. I knew this was just the beginning. There was still a lot to resolve. Many truths to discover. And what Clara could never imagine, was what awaited her just ahead. Daniel left the restaurant without looking back, with his heart torn, but his face firm, as if each step were a nail driven into the end. He didn't go home that night, nor did he sleep. He drove aimlessly for hours until he parked in front of the sea, with the first traces of dawn coloring the sky. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just remained motionless, like someone who saw their past implode before their eyes. I thought about the words I didn't say, the years invested, the layers of a life that was now crumbling like watercolor paint. But along with the pain, something even more powerful was born, the certainty that he would no longer be a spectator of his own story. It was early in the morning when he called his lawyer and asked him to bring forward the delivery of the divorce documents. Today. It needs to be today. His voice didn't shake. And the plan, the one he had been silently preparing since the suspicion became evidence, would finally take shape. Clara didn't sleep that night. She returned home stunned, with her hands shaking and her eyes lost. Her lover tried to follow her to understand, he tried to calm her down, but she pushed him away with a dry gesture, not knowing whether she was more frightened by Daniel's presence or by her own reflection in the mirror. For the first time, he realized that everything he had built with him could truly be over. He tried to call, sent messages, begged for a conversation, but Daniel remained silent. When the day broke, she was still sitting on the floor of her room, hugging her knees, trying to understand where everything went wrong, how she got to that point. What seemed like just an escape valve, a moment to breathe out of the suffocating routine, was now the trigger for a bomb that destroyed what was left of their marriage. The next morning the documents arrived. A brown envelope, heavy as lead. When she opened it and saw the title, Divorce Petition, Clara felt her stomach turn. Signed, stamped, the paperwork made it clear that Daniel not only knew, but had already prepared with time and precision. There was no fight. There was no discussion. Just the legal coldness of the end. Tried to contact again. This time, Daniel responded with a single sentence, "If you want to talk, come to the house at 8 p.m. Just once. It was with her heart pounding that she arrived that day. I didn't know what to expect. He planned what he would say, rehearsed justifications, but when he opened the door, all that came out was a shaky whisper, "Please, listen to me." Daniel didn't interrupt her. He just walked to the living room and sat down in front of her. The serene look contrasted with the storm he had experienced inside. Clara began to speak, running over words, trying to explain the inexplicable. She said she felt invisible, that she wasn't looking for love, but just to find herself again as a woman. She said she never thought about leaving the marriage, that she still loved him, that she was weak. Daniel listened with a neutral expression, just nodding his head from time to time. And then, when she said that everything could be different if he just gave her a chance, he got up, went to the office, and came back with a smaller envelope. He handed it to her, looking straight into her eyes. "You better read it before you keep asking to come back." Inside the envelope were copies of contracts, records and documents belonging to the couple's assets. Clara leafed through the pages without understanding, until her eyes stopped on a highlighted section. Daniel had transferred all assets into his name in recent months. The house, the applications, the movable assets, everything. What she believed she would share in an amicable divorce, or that she could use as a bargaining chip, was no longer hers. Without reaction, she looked up at him. Did you prepare all this?" he murmured. Daniel nodded with a calm gesture. "When I realized something was wrong, I tried to protect myself. The apartment was mine before the marriage, the investments were in my name, only a few joint applications were legally withdrawn. You will receive what the law requires. Nothing more." The tone was so serene that it hurt more than a scream. "Did you know all along?" she asked, her voice cracking. 3 weeks ago, he replied. "And why didn't you tell me before?" Daniel took a deep breath, walked around the room for a few seconds and then turned to her. "Because I wanted to see how far you would go. I wanted to know who you were when you thought you weren't being seen." The silence that followed was crueler than any argument. Clara cried in silence, curled up on the sofa. But there was still something inside her that refused to accept defeat. "I made a mistake, but that doesn't erase everything we've experienced. Please don't treat me like an enemy. I still love you." Daniel approached, knelt before her, and with teary eyes, replied, "I loved you too. With everything I had. But what you destroyed, there is no going back." He got up and headed for the door. "I need you to go now." Clara tried to say something else, but her voice wouldn't come out. She left with slow steps, like someone carrying the pieces of herself. In the days that followed, she tried to get back on her feet. He sought friends, advice, and even sought therapy. But the emptiness was constant. With each attempt at reconnection, Daniel kept his distance. He didn't block her, but he didn't respond either. It was as if she had turned a page with a coldness she didn't recognize. Until, on a random weekend, as he passed by the old cafe they used to frequent, he saw Daniel talking to a woman. Young, elegant, with a serene smile. The two laughed, shared looks that she knew well. He felt the floor disappear. She stood there, watching, until he saw her. Clara made to wave, but Daniel just looked away, as if she were part of a distant past. It was in that moment that she knew, he was moving on. In truth. Clara tried to leave, but the steps didn't follow. He sat down on the bench in the nearest square and looked at his shaking hands. She had lost. But more than that, he had underestimated the man with whom he shared years of life. She never imagined he would react like this. That he was capable of planning, protecting himself, acting with such coldness and precision. She thought she would always have time, that she could always fix it. But on that bench, alone, with the cold wind cutting her face, she understood that not all love is eternal, and that betrayal doesn't just destroy someone else, it also destroys itself. Daniel, on the other hand, returning home that night, did not feel vindicated. He felt free. For the first time in a long time, I could breathe without fear. He knew the worst was over. But there was still an ace up his sleeve. Something that Clara was unaware of. Something that, when it came to light, would completely change the way she saw everything. A cunningly kept secret. And that he was about to reveal. The following week, Daniel's routine followed a silent, discreet course, but full of new meanings. Mornings no longer began with the muffled sound of the shower or the clinking of cups in the kitchen. The house seemed bigger, more airy, as if the void left by Clara gave space to a new lightness. But there were still pending issues, remnants of a past that insisted on leaving traces. Clara remained insistent. He sent sporadic messages, sometimes trying to talk, sometimes threatening lawyers, trying to claim some part of what they previously shared. Daniel responded with the objectivity of someone who no longer recognizes the person on the other end of the line. She wavered between pleading and revolt, trying to understand how he had managed to turn everything in his favor, how the life she knew could have fallen apart so quickly. But he remained irreducible. He had made his decision and there was no room for return. The past, for him, was now just a reference, not a home. On a random Saturday, while organizing boxes with old objects left over from the wedding, Daniel found a forgotten pen drive at the bottom of a drawer. He thought about discarding it, but out of curiosity he connected it to the computer. Inside, there were photos, scanned documents, and a folder labeled 3 years ago. When he opened it, he came across purchase and sale contracts, authorizations for the transfer of goods and, most unexpectedly, records of bank transactions involving large amounts taken from an old joint application. He looked at the dates carefully. They were before the most evident distance between them, even before the signs of crisis. Clara had moved significant amounts of money without his knowledge. Everything was recorded clearly, with digital signatures and traces of emails that, when read, made your blood run cold. That's when everything started to fall into place. Buying her new car, which he believed was a gift from his parents. The lightning-fast renovation of her mother's apartment, which seemed to have come out of nowhere. The theater course, which he imagined would be paid for by the school. Clara had begun to disengage from him long before the emotional betrayal. And this wasn't just a breach of trust, it was a fraud. She had begun to transfer amounts discreetly, used his password, took advantage of the marital bond to carry out actions that he would never authorize. What seemed to be an emotional betrayal now took on deeper, darker tones. Daniel took a deep breath, closed the files, and at that same moment called his lawyer. They scheduled a meeting for the following day. He didn't just want to end a marriage, now he wanted justice. The next morning, when presenting the documents, he heard the lawyer's cold assessment: she committed the crime of embezzlement. You can sue her for fraud, misrepresentation, and property damage. This goes far beyond a contested divorce. We are talking about serious legal consequences. Daniel, his voice breaking but without hesitation, replied, I want this to go as far as necessary. It's not out of revenge. It's out of dignity. I knew the process would be long, painful, but necessary. It was the last break of the bond. The final blow to a relationship that had no return. When Clara received the notification, it was like being punched in the stomach. I didn't expect it. He never thought that Daniel would find out or that, even if he found out, he would have the courage to act. She arranged a meeting with him at the cafe where it all started, the same place where one day he asked her to be his girlfriend. I hope to be able to reverse, explain, manipulate. When he arrived, she tried to smile, but her face was tense, desperate. Do you want to destroy me? He began, his voice trembling. Daniel, calm, sat down and simply replied, no. I just want the truth to have consequences. She leaned on the table, looking for that man who once looked at her with tenderness. You know that I loved you. That we experienced real things. Why expose me like that? Daniel stared at her for long seconds before responding. Because you exposed me long before that. Not only did you cheat on me with another man. You betrayed me in what I believed to be inviolable, our trust. You used my name, my access, my money. And worse, you looked me in the eye every day as if none of this was happening. Clara tried to argue, saying that it was just a temporary loan, that she intended to return it, that she used the money for necessary things. But his words fell empty, without consistency. Daniel, without raising his voice, spoke with precision. You took away my right to choose. When someone steals from you while still sharing a bed with you, that's not a mistake, it's character. Clara looked down, and for the first time since everything came to light, she felt true shame. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, got up and left without looking back. The judicial process continued its course. Clara had her accounts blocked, was summoned to provide clarification and had to deal with the exposure of what she did. Mutual friends started to move away. His reputation, once intact, was now the subject of whispered conversations. The school where she taught initiated an internal procedure, and she ended up resigning before the situation reached the board. The lover, upon discovering that his name was also included in some transfers, disappeared. He deleted the networks, changed the number, disappeared. Clara was left alone. No Daniel, no support, no justifications. Daniel, on the other hand, rebuilt himself. He bought a smaller apartment, in another neighborhood. He reworked his routine, went back to running outdoors, and reconnected with old friendships. He started attending cultural events, exhibitions, reading clubs. And it was on one of these nights that he met Beatrice, an art curator passionate about classical music and untold stories. The meeting between them was subtle, unpretentious. But soon the coffees turned into long conversations, the conversations turned into walks, and the walks into moonlit meetings. Beatrice didn't ask questions about the past. She just listened, with respect and patience, to Daniel's time. And that, for him, was everything. For the first time in a long time, he felt safe with someone. Not because of the absence of risk, but because of the presence of truth. Months later, Clara tried one last time. He showed up at his new address, claiming he wanted to return an old book. Daniel met at the door, polite but firm. You don't need to go in. She hesitated, holding the book in both hands. You look fine, he said with a bitter smile. I am, he replied. And I hope one day you will be too. Clara looked into his eyes and for the first time understood that this man, who had been within reach for so long, was now unattainable. Not because of physical distance, but because of evolution. She had stopped in time. Daniel, no. He had gone through the pain, faced the lie, overcome the loss. And now, it was whole. She handed over the book, took a step back and whispered an almost imperceptible, sorry. Daniel didn't respond. He just closed the door gently, as if closing a chapter that no longer needs to be reread. On the other side of the house, Beatrice was waiting for him with 2 coffees and a smile. Daniel hugged her, and as he did so, he became certain of something he already suspected: a fresh start is often the best kind of ending. And the one who was betrayed was now someone born again. The secret that Clara had tried so carefully to hide, the silent embezzlement, the disguised transfers, the financial manipulation within a marriage, was now part of a public process. But more than that, it was part of her consciousness. Wherever he went, he would carry not only the guilt of emotional betrayal, but the mark of someone who destroyed something that could never be rebuilt. Because it wasn't just love she lost. It was respect, dignity, and the right to return. And Daniel, finally, found what he sought for so long: peace. The judicial process ran silently, although intensely, like an underground river that no one sees, but that at any moment could make the ground give way. Clara, now immersed in financial and personal problems, found herself surrounded by demands that were not just legal, but moral and emotional. Her parents, once staunch supporters, had reduced contact, clearly uncomfortable with their daughter's choices and consequences. The old support network began to dissolve as the story took on more public, albeit discreet, contours. Her lawyers were looking for agreements, appeals, strategies to alleviate the seriousness of the facts, but Daniel remained firm, unshakable. He did not seek inhumane punishment, nor humiliation, just justice and closure. I wanted to close a cycle with the integrity of those who were injured and chose to rebuild themselves instead of fighting back with the same blade. But still, the weight of what he had discovered did not leave his consciousness. There were days when pain gave way to perplexity, and nights when, even next to Beatrice, the questions returned in silence. At what moment did everything start to fall apart without him noticing? Clara, in turn, found herself trapped in a reality that she herself constructed. The justifications she told herself no longer supported the sleepless nights, nor the lack of ground she felt when waking up alone in a cramped rented apartment, far from the home she once called her own. He spent his days reviewing papers, memories, old messages, trying to find a timeline that justified his choices. There was a time when she felt admired, desired, present in someone's life. And at that time, everything seemed to make sense. But what she did went beyond the limits of any existential crisis or emotional need. She was fully aware that she had crossed ethical and emotional boundaries that placed her in a dark place that would be difficult to return from. It wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the revelation of a side of herself that even she herself was afraid to face. Meanwhile, Beatrice and Daniel deepened a delicate and mature connection. There was no rush between them, no theatrical declarations. Just a serene sharing of life, built on sincere dialogues and respected spaces. She understood that Daniel still carried traces of a pain that did not go away with time, but with understanding. That's why I didn't press. He was presence when he needed to speak and respectful absence when silence was necessary. The two found a calm rhythm, as if they were dancing to a slow song, without needing to keep time. Daniel was beginning to discover that love, when born after chaos, doesn't need to be overwhelming, it needs to be true. And that made him stronger. It was as if, finally, he was coming back to himself, not as before, but as a new version of a man who had learned to look at his own worth honestly. Even with all the damage, Daniel found himself sometimes questioning what he should do from now on in relation to the process. As much as he felt he needed to maintain the integrity of the decision, he knew that carrying it through to the end meant sinking Clara even further. The moral dilemma arose with force. Should he stand firm and make her bear every consequence of her actions, or would there be room for legal forgiveness, even if emotional forgiveness was impossible? He consulted his lawyer, reviewed the clauses, analyzed the possibilities. Clara had acted with intent, yes, but she was not a dangerous criminal. He was someone who lost himself in selfish, thoughtless choices, which now became an abyss beneath his own feet. Beatrice, upon learning of the doubt that was beginning to worry him, did not try to influence him. He just said that he needed to act according to what he could sustain in front of his own mirror. And it resonated inside him for days. It was on a gray and cold afternoon that Daniel made the decision to offer Clara a final agreement. He would bear part of the debts caused by the irregular movement, as long as she publicly assumed responsibility and ended the process with dignity. There would be no humiliation, no scandal. Just the end. Clara received the proposal with surprise. I didn't expect any gesture of compassion from him. He hesitated, tried to negotiate, but soon realized that there was no margin. It was either accept and end it once or for all or continue to bleed in the legal arena until there was nothing left. After days of silence, he responded with a dry, formal, yes. Deep down, I knew that this was the greatest gesture of mercy I would ever receive. And perhaps the last. The day they signed the closure of the process was silent. They were side by side in the law office room. They avoided looking at each other. Clara wore black, discreetly, with her hair tied up. Daniel wore the same neutral expression he had maintained since the beginning. When she finished signing, she looked him in the eye for the first time in months. I wanted to say something. But he looked away. Not out of contempt, but out of preservation. I knew that hearing anything there would only bring back pain that was already in the healing process. They left through different doors, without shaking hands, without saying goodbye. Just the sound of pen on paper and the soft slam of the door marking the end. Days later, Clara decided to change cities. I needed to start over, away from everything. Away from memories, looks, judgments. He looked for a job at a small school, accepted a lower salary, and began to live simply, without the old habits of consumption and ostentation that he maintained. Suffering, little by little, gave way to reflection. She started writing letters that she would never send, trying to organize thoughts, feelings, trying to understand how she had come so far away from herself. The reconstruction process would be slow, but necessary. For the first time in a long time, she understood that what she lost was not just the love of a man, but respect for herself. And that, she would have to regain alone. Daniel, in turn, continued his life firmly, but without rushing. Beatrice was by his side, and every day felt more right. They didn't talk about the past, but there was an implicit respect for everything the other had experienced. He knew that she also had her pains, her traumas, and that brought them closer. They were two adults who were not looking for saviors, but partners. One day, while watching Beatrice preparing coffee, Daniel had a thought that caught him off guard. He wondered if one day he would love again with the same intensity as before. And the answer came effortlessly, no. Because love, now, no longer needed the blind intensity of before, but the clear presence of now. And that was enough. The fresh start, although peaceful, was not without dilemmas. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Daniel found himself remembering Clara, not with longing, but with a strange kind of mourning. It had been an important part of his life. I couldn't erase the years, the stories, the smiles. But I knew that remembering didn't mean wanting it back. It was just an echo of something that existed, and was now part of the past. A part that needed to be remembered so that it would never happen again. With the end of the process and the new phase taking hold, Daniel was invited to participate in an architectural project in another city. It would be a 6-month period, a golden opportunity that he had turned down in the past because of his marriage. Now, with freedom in his hands, he considered accepting. He spoke to Beatrice, who supported him. He said he would be there, that they could visit each other, that the love between them did not depend on geography, but on connection. It was at that moment that Daniel understood that the cycle had truly closed. It was ready. For the first time in a long time, I could move forward without looking back. There was still one last step left. One last gesture. Something he needed to do not for Clara, but for himself. And he already knew exactly how to conclude this story. Daniel's trip took place in the middle of autumn, when the streets were beginning to be filled with dry leaves, and the air took on that melancholic tone that only transitions can offer. It was as if the world around him was accurately reflecting the internal moment he was living in, a phase between what was left behind and what was yet to come. Upon arriving at his new destination, he was greeted enthusiastically by the architectural project team, a cultural center focused on contemporary art, which would require more than just technique from him, it would require sensitivity. And perhaps that was what attracted him most to that job, the chance to leave his mark on something alive, plural, in a construction that would house other people's stories, voices and movements. For the first time in years, he felt like he was producing something that had meaning beyond himself. There was something deeply restorative about the idea of rebuilding, of erecting structures after dealing with ruins for so long. In the first few days, the routine was intense. He got involved with the team, participated in meetings, aesthetic debates and technical decisions. There wasn't much time to think about anything else, and that, in a way, freed him. But at night, when returning to the small loft rented by the construction company, it was inevitable that the thoughts would return. He read Beatrice's emails with affection, responded with details, they exchanged photos, audios and tender words. They maintained a firm bond, even from a distance, and this sustained him. Beatrice was the calm anchor in a sea that still moved with memories. And he knew that, even far away, it was the place he wanted to return to when everything was finished. On one of these lonely nights, Daniel decided to respond to one of the letters that Clara had sent months before. Not because of nostalgia, but because he understood that there was a last chapter to be written. He took paper, pen and began writing not with spite, but with raw honesty. He said there was no more hurt, just understanding. That the pain she caused no longer defined him, that he no longer carried the weight of humiliation. That he had remade himself not despite what she did, but because he accepted the truth that she no longer belonged in his life. And at the end, he wrote a single sentence that summarized everything: "I hope you too find your way to start over." He folded the letter, put it in the envelope and sent it to the address he still remembered. I didn't expect an answer, and I didn't want one. The gesture was for him, not for her. Clara received the letter on a Tuesday. As she read it, she cried for the first time from a different place, not from regret or despair, but from relief. It was as if that envelope carried the final seal of what had been his old life. She read and reread each line, absorbing the fact that Daniel was at peace, that he didn't hate her, that he had left everything behind. And there, sitting on the balcony of her small apartment, she understood that it was time to do the same. The following week, she signed up for a creative writing class, something she had always wanted to do and never had the courage to do. He began to record his experiences, transforming memories into stories, pain into literature. And, discreetly, he began to find meaning again. Meanwhile, Daniel immersed himself in every detail of the project as if it were an extension of himself. I chose materials with precision, visited construction sites, watched each brick being laid. As the center began to take shape, something within it also began to solidify. He felt useful, present, whole. He was no longer a man trying to stay upright after the storm, he was someone walking steadily on the ground he himself helped build. One day, walking through one of the galleries still being finished, he received an unexpected message from Beatrice. It just said, "I miss you, but I know you're exactly where you're supposed to be. When you get back, I want you to tell me every detail of what you built there. And I want us to start ours." Reading that message made him stop for a few minutes. He leaned against one of the newly installed metal structures and let himself stay there, feeling the immensity of what she had said. "I want us to start ours." For the first time, he felt like there was room for it. Not as a replacement for the past, but as a conscious choice for the future. He smiled, and in that smile there was the weight of everything he had experienced, but also the lightness of everything that was yet to come. A few days before the end of the project, he was invited to give a talk about the process of creating the space. He sat in front of dozens of young architecture students, and when telling his journey, he didn't spare the most personal part. He spoke of new beginnings, of failures, of how the most important buildings were not just made of concrete and steel, but of courage and truth. He received a standing ovation. And as he looked at those beating hands, he felt that he had finally closed his own foundation. When he returned home, weeks later, Beatrice was waiting for him at the airport exit. There was no scene, no public statements. Just a long, silent hug that said it all. They went to his new apartment together, with boxes still to be opened, pictures to be hung and spaces to be filled. And he knew, this was the beginning of what he had promised. They started planning small trips, talked about adopting a dog, cooked together. The nights were filled with laughter again and the days were plans. But everything was done lightly, with a care that only those who have known pain are capable of offering. Clara, in turn, received a proposal to publish a collection of texts. Her style was raw, visceral, with a female narrative voice that wasn't afraid to be imperfect. The publisher saw strength in those stories and proposed a modest circulation. She accepted. The book wouldn't change her life financially, but it would make her feel like she had something to offer the world, even after she had destroyed so much. During the launch event, a lady approached and said, "You write like someone who bleeds, but heals others." Clara smiled with teary eyes. For the first time in a long time, he felt useful again. He still carried ghosts, it's true. But now I had somewhere to put them. Daniel and Beatrice, months later, walked together to a small clearing where a sculpture had been installed in the cultural center. It was a piece signed by a local artist, with shapes that suggested found fragments. Beatrice stopped in front of her and said, I think that's what we are here. Two pieces that came together without trying to hide the cracks. Daniel shook her hand and, without words, confirmed. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about recognizing that it existed and still choosing to live something new. The story had not yet come to an end, but the path was now different. And this time, he knew exactly where he was stepping. Time followed its course with the silent brutality of those who wait for no one. A year has passed since the night Daniel decided to turn the page with firm hands, and in silence, he built not only a new life, but a new look at everything he once was. The cultural center, now completed, had become a reference in innovation and local art. His signature on the project was praised not only by critics, but by everyone who frequented the space and felt, without knowing exactly why, that there was more there than well-designed walls, there was truth. Daniel was no longer remembered as the betrayed man or the discreet architect. He was now recognized as someone who knew how to transform pain into power, collapse into structure. And this accompanied him in each new step he took, including alongside Beatrice, whose presence had taken root without haste, with depth, until it blossomed as a partnership. They decided to live together. Nothing grand, no fuss, just the mature decision to share life with those who recognize us in the most complete version, without wanting to erase scars. Their relationship grew at the right time, respecting the limits of two adults marked by difficult histories. Beatrice brought stability, but also provoked Daniel to dream again. He encouraged new projects, trips, debates on topics that he would never explore alone. In return, he offered her a rare listening, a silent presence that welcomed without trying to fix it. Over time, they found together what so many relationships fail to achieve, tranquility. And perhaps this was the most unlikely ending for anyone who, one day, thought they wouldn't even be able to move on. Meanwhile, Clara faced a slow reconstruction process. The book released had a modest repercussion, but deeply touched a specific niche of readers, women who made mistakes, who were judged, who lost themselves and were looking for a point of return. She started to be invited to conversation circles, meetings at community centers, small but important literary events. There was no glamour, but there was honesty. And for the first time in her life, Clara felt that her words served a greater purpose than her own narrative. I still lived with financial limitations, shared an apartment with a younger colleague and worked with private classes, but, somehow, this was enough to maintain a dignified life. The pride that once blinded her had given way to genuine humility. She had become someone who did not deny her mistakes, but carried them as a warning, not as an excuse. One afternoon, at the end of a lecture at a public school, she was approached by a teenager with deep eyes and a shy voice. The young woman said that, after reading her book, she decided to break off a relationship with a married man, and that, for the first time, she felt capable of valuing herself. Clara listened with wet eyes, held the girl's hands and simply told her that she still had time not to repeat the mistakes she made. As she left the event, walking along the uneven stone sidewalk, she thought about how, ironically, she had found purpose in the very thing that destroyed her. I wasn't looking for redemption, because I knew that some pains can't be erased, but I felt that at least now I could give something to the world besides regret. In an unexpected coincidence, which life sometimes masterfully organizes, Daniel and Clara's paths crossed again. It was in a neighborhood bookstore, where he had gone to buy a gift for Beatrice's niece. As he turned the aisle of contemporary novels, he came across a small totem with books by local authors, and among them, Clara's. The cover was sober, the title discreet. On impulse, he picked up the copy, turned the back cover and found a small photo of her, smiling with the serenity of someone who was no longer looking for applause. He hesitated for a few seconds and decided to buy. Read it in 2 days. The text was sincere, naked, without attempts to justify itself. In several passages, he recognized excerpts from the life they shared, narrated with a sensitivity that, for an instant, moved him. Without pretensions, he wrote to the email left at the end of the book. He said that he had read it, that he respected her path, and that he wanted her to continue producing, because her words had value. Clara responded 2 days later. She thanked him and said that if he had managed to read it without feeling hurt, then she could finally believe that she was really doing something right. They didn't exchange numbers, they didn't make an appointment, they didn't get back in touch. But, in that brief email, they both understood that there were no more loose ends between them. It was the silent closure of a story that, one day, hurt. Too much time passed, and a new chapter was drawn in Daniel's life. Beatrice was invited to an artistic residency outside the country, and he, without hesitation, said they should go together. They planned the change like someone planting something new in fertile soil. It was a chance to live another culture, another language, another life. And for the first time since the divorce, Daniel felt that he was no longer running away from what he had experienced, but walking with purpose into the unknown. The decision was simple: she would take care of the artistic side, and he would collaborate on local sustainable architecture projects. The new city welcomed them with open arms. It was like starting over, but this time without pain. Meanwhile, Clara decided to accept a proposal to co-author a new book, in partnership with a psychologist specializing in abusive relationships. He would share his experience in chapters interspersed with technical analyses. He accepted reluctantly at first, but soon immersed himself in the project. He came to understand that his past, although irreversible, could be a warning tool. And once again, he found in this a way to forgive himself. There was no new love, at least not for now. But Clara no longer felt lonely as before. I had friends, reading, routine and purpose. His redemption was not in winning anyone back, but in rebuilding himself little by little, piece by piece. Years later, on another continent, Daniel and Beatrice were walking through a wooded park on a late spring afternoon. She spoke excitedly about an installation she intended to set up, and he listened attentively, holding her hand intertwined with his. They stopped in front of a small lake and sat down on a bench. There, without needing to say much, he realized that everything made sense now. Every pain, every disappointment, every new beginning, everything had been part of a process that brought him here. He no longer carried any residue of sadness. Just gratitude for having had the courage to not stay where I no longer fit. And this is the story of a man who was betrayed but chose not to become a victim. Who lost the love of youth, but found the peace of maturity. Who faced the worst in people and discovered the best in themselves. And of a woman who, upon falling into her own abyss, decided not to bury herself in it, but to build a ladder, step by step, until she found the light again. If you've made it this far, now it's your turn to tell us, what did you think of this story? Leave your opinion in the comments. We want to know how this narrative impacted you. And of course, if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories that will always surprise and move you. Remember, this channel does not support, does not normalize and never romanticizes any type of betrayal. Here, each story exists to show that cheating destroys more than relationships, it destroys trust, identity, and peace. But also to show that the truth, even painful, can be the beginning of a great new beginning. Until the next story.